Shalom, welcome to the Jewish View. My name is Rabbi Nachman Simon with the Chabad House of Dalmar, together with my co-host Mark Vronich of jbiztechvalley.com and Statewide News Service.
Well, Rabbi, we have, the premier, the person who speaks the best about the Holocaust in this area, and he's Stephen Berk. He's Henry and Sally Schaffer Professor of Holocaust and Judaic Studies at Union College, and I've heard you speak so many times about the Holocaust, and you're so eloquent, and you're so knowledgeable, and I know that you always say, I'm a historian, not a prophet. So I'll keep that in mind, and but I really hope that, welcome to the show, and I'm glad you're here.
It's nice to be here.
Professor, I wanted to ask, Holocaust is now 70 years old, that when it was finally 1948 finished, thank God. But people always ask that why is it important, not only for Jewish people, because you're a professor, you're not you're a union, and union's a non-Jewish sectarian college. Why is it important for everybody, not only Jews, of course, for Jewish history, but why for, maybe you say, non-Jews to learn about the Holocaust also?
Because it was industrialized mass murder. And the murder was carried out on the basis of what the Nazis considered to be the racial deficiencies and the racial attributes of the Jewish people. Unfortunately, since the Holocaust, we have seen things, if not they're Holocaust-like. And therefore, we ought to study why this happened. That is why the Holocaust, the destruction of European Jewry took place. What were the motives? What were the ideas? What were the techniques that we used? And maybe we could just learn how to prevent these things from taking place in the future.
You see things happening in our current events that are, like you say, maybe not at the mass scale of gas chambers and the like, but like you were just saying, things that are in that ballpark, so to speak, of just this mass killings.
We have seen that, I think, in Cambodia. We saw that with the Khmer Rouge killing probably maybe as many as 2 million Cambodians. The techniques are different, the rationale is different. But in the end, it's mass murder. And that's what we've got to try and stop.
And there are some examples in African countries.
In African countries
also.
And right before our eyes, what we are witnessing. Had we not bombed, had not the American government, the Obama administration, ordered the bombing of the ISIS people, probably we would have seen the murder of tens of thousands of these people, the Yazidis. Now you can ask the question, should it have been done earlier, the bombing? The answer is probably yes. But we did save these people. And I must tell you, as I think you certainly know, and probably most of the audience knows, there's no difference in terms of what Hamas says and what the Nazis said. There's no difference at all. There's no difference in the aspirations. That is, if Hamas had the means, that's the real difference. Hamas doesn't have the means that the Nazis had. But if Hamas had the means, they'd kill all 6 million Israelis, all 6 million Jewish Israelis. I mean, that's, again, for want of a better cliche, that's money in the bank. Hezbollah has reputed, the Sheikh Nasrallah is reputed to have said, it's a pity that all the Jews in the world have not really gathered in Israel because they could all be destroyed then in one blow.
Are there 6 million Jewish Israelis?
Yes.
Isn't that a coincidence that's how many Jews were killed in the Holocaust?
Right. That's a coincidence. Today, virtually all demographers believe that the largest Jewish community in the world is now in Israel. It is no longer in the United States.
Wow. Why is that?
Well,
generally speaking.
Well, there are two things. One, there's this constant flow of aliyah. People from all over the world have come to Israel. And then we get into that very delicate description of assimilation in American society. So that plus virtually zero population growth on the part of the Jewish people in this country, assimilation, the massive flow of particularly Jews from the former Soviet Union and from other places, that has really created the change that has taken place.
So draw me into the time in the 1930s and 40s when the Holocaust was, when Nazis were building up after World War II, after World War I, maybe during World War I, and then all the way through to their demise at World War II.
I also, once you're saying that, just a caveat, just see that maybe parallel. That's why I'm trying to always parallel things to modern day. Where can it happen here? Because Germany wasn't like a third world country, and it wasn't a backward country. They were, on the contrary, intellectual. Can that same situation that led up, what Mark is asking, happen? God forbid, but could it even possibly happen
After
here?
Auschwitz, all bets are off. Anything can happen anywhere. It is unlikely, very, very unlikely, that it will happen in the United States. Given the traditions of our country, given the fact that this is a very pluralistic country. In Germany, we were really the only other. That's not true in our country. There are other people here. I'll put it somewhat cynically. If you're a bigot, you're in heaven in America. There's so many people to hate. Black people, Latinos, Jews, Asian Americans. In fact, again, this really gets us out beyond the realm of the Holocaust. The Jewish people in this country have been shielded by a Latino, an Asian, and Black umbrella.
It's interesting.
When our country, this is a wonderful country, the greatest country in the world, but sometimes our compatriots can get nasty. When they get nasty, they usually do it on the basis of race, not on religion. And when it comes to race, unfortunately, African Americans have been the lightning rod. They're the ones that have drawn the enormous hostility. There are other groups too as well. So given the traditions of our country, that is the democratic traditions with a small d, the democratic traditions of our country, given the pluralistic nature of the United States, and given, of course, the amazing wealth of American society. You know, you'll never get me to sing the song, but we all knew it as children. It runs something like this: the land was sweet and good, that's the refrain, and we did what we could. In other words, you can't make it in the Northeast, you go to the Midwest. You can't make it in the Midwest, you go to the West Coast. You can't make it there, you go to the Northwest. There's room for everybody in American society. There has never been that ferocious competition for jobs, for university placement, for professional placement in this country that existed in the old country. That again, and we are not the only other, but in Germany we were the only other. Now to get back to what Mark was saying here, here's the limits of the historian. I can tell you what Hitler said. I can tell you what Hitler did. I can tell you how he did it. I can tell you why he did certain things. I can't tell you, nor can any historian worth his or her salt, if they're honest, can tell you why Hitler was Hitler. Was it, again, his father beat him? Unfortunately, there are other people whose fathers beat him. They don't become Hitlers. So I can't tell you why he developed this ferocious anti-Semitism, but it was ferocious, and it was never used. I'll put it another way. It was on occasion used to mobilize the German masses, but this was not a cynical manipulation. Hitler was a true believer, and he gathered around himself true believers. That's what made Auschwitz possible. That's what made the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing squads in Eastern Europe, particularly in the occupied areas of the Soviet Union, possible. After all, even Himmler himself, in a speech made at Poznan in 1943, when he addressed the Gauleiters, he said, it's not easy. You and I know, the rest of the German people don't know. Not easy to line them up. Line up men, women, and children, shoot them, kill them, and then stack them up. You can only do that if you are embracing an absolutely ferocious, vituperative ideology that saw the Jews as the ultimate evil. Now, at every Nazi party rally, there was a slogan. People think Hitler coined the slogan. Actually, the slogan was coined in the 1870s. In German, it is, Die Juden sind unser Unglück. The Jews are our misfortune. Hitler and lots of Germans, how many a matter of debate, but lots of them believed that the Jews were responsible for a multitude of sins. Virtually everything that had taken place that was wrong could be attributed to the Jews. Everything, particularly anything bad that happened to Germany. The Jews were responsible for it. That, incidentally, as Rabbi Simon has said, to bring this up to the president, that's exactly what Hamas is saying.
Well, I feel
it's exactly, let me just say to you, Hamas has said The Jews are responsible for the French Revolution, not the Zionists, the Jews. The Jews are responsible for the revolutions in Europe in 1848. The Jews are responsible for both world wars. The Jews are responsible for the communist succession to power. The Jews are ultimately responsible for the Holocaust. So this is the German expression would be a Weltanschauung. This was the worldview of the Nazis, and therefore the logic was, in order for us to save ourselves, we must eliminate this particular group of people, the Jews, from the face of the earth.
I have two comments. One is I feel like people blame me if it rains outside, so I kind of get that. I don't know if it's in my blood or whatever, but you know, anything happens that's out of my control, it's still my fault.
That's right.
You know,
the Jews were held responsible in the case of going back to what you had asked me.
Well,
the Jews were responsible in Hitler's eyes and in large numbers of Germans for Germany's loss in World War I,
right.
for the Treaty of Versailles, for the inflation of 23, the depression of 1929, and the humiliation of Germany. The Jews were held responsible for this.
Okay, so I understand the issue of why 6 million Jews are so, it's so dramatic because there weren't very many more than 6 million Jews around at the time.
There were 9 million.
Okay, so two-thirds
of the European Jewry was murdered by the Nazis. Had they occupied the Soviet Union,
but
they would have killed the other 3 million.
But I'm told that there were 12 million Christians or Catholics
that is correct.
Who were killed, but that didn't put as much of a dent. It wasn't two-thirds of their population.
Right.
So here we got 18 million people. We shouldn't lose sight of the fact that there were twice as many non-Jews that were killed in the Holocaust.
That is correct. Elie Wiesel put it right, as he often does. Elie Wiesel said, all of the Jews were victims, but not all of the victims were Jews.
Mm-hmm.
And that is correct. The difference is the only group of people in German-occupied Europe that was singled out for destruction, absolute destruction, were the Jews. In a letter sent by Himmler to SS men in the Ukraine, the letter went something like this. We must kill them, he said of the Jews, down to the last child in the cradle. Whatever the Nazis did to the Poles, and they did terrible things to the Poles and to other people, during the war, the only people posited for absolute destruction, the only people was the Jews.
You know, I asked a question of another professor, and I don't know if there's an answer, but it just bothers me, where you could see an ignoramus, an illiterate person could, back to that issue, blame the Jewish people. But how does, I mean, there were professors, there were doctors, I mean, intellectuals, people knew books and they knew history, they had to take some courses. And how could they be so blind? I mean, maybe there's no answer to it, but it just bothers me because you don't understand how, blame the Jews like you say for everything. Well, it's so ridiculous, it's so idiotic. How could any person with half a brain, say such a thing?
Because they weren't being blamed, it was the Jews.
Yeah,
It was someone else
it's a very good question, and you're absolutely right, there's no definitive answer. One, if I took a stab at it, I would say there's a long tradition of anti-Jewish sentiment in Germany. Jews have been blamed for many things, going back to the 14th century and the Black Death, for example. Jews were accused of poisoning wells. It has to do, here we get into a delicate area, again with religious animosity, Christian religious antipathy towards the Jews. That operated for many centuries, and it is difficult to get suspicion of the Jews out of the mindset of large numbers of people. Then the linkage of Jews with communism. The chief rabbi of Moscow put it very, very well in an interesting statement. The Trotskys play the tune, the Bronsteins pay the piper. Trotsky's real name was Bronstein. When he was asked, what are you, Comrade Trotsky? He gave a good Marxist-Leninist answer, a proletarian internationalist. But everybody knew that he was a Jew, high-ranking member of the Communist Party. For many people, he was a Žid, he was a kike. And that linkage of Jews to communism, the overwhelming majority of Jews, now here's an interesting, not an asymmetry, but interesting point. The overwhelming majority of Jews were either non-communist or anti-communist. They opposed communism. But a disproportionate number of the communists were Jews. And that's important. For those who feared communism, I tell my students, you cannot understand the 20th century unless you understand the appeal of communism and the fear of communism. And for those who feared communism, who hated it, saw it as the antithesis to virtually everything that was decent, many of them associated this with the Jews. Again, the overwhelming majority of Jews were non-communists, but a disproportionate number of them were. So there's one of the old Soviet jokes. Zinoviev, who is Jewish, talks to Kamenev, who is Jewish, talks to Trotsky, who is Jewish, and says, let's kick Lenin out and we can have a minion. Now, that's a silly story. They believe these are what would be called deracinated Jews. These were Jews that were born Jewish, divorced themselves from the Jewish people, persecuted Jews, the religion, Judaism, and persecuted Zionists, but didn't make any difference. They were communists, and for those who hated communism, this was a problem. The other thing is the charismatic appeal of Adolf Hitler and his ability to come across as the greatest of all German nationalists. So even those educated people who probably in their gut and in their minds knew that the Jews, this will talk about the Jews doing this and the Jews doing that, Jews stabbing Germany in the back, many of them didn't believe it. But they went along with it because they saw Hitler as the one man that could make Germany great again.
Was it because of his confidence? When you listen to his voice,
Self-confidence,
there was so much
self-confidence. But what many people don't realize, a study was done in the 1930s. It was not the best study. It was where some American, I think, political scientists went over to Germany, and they gave questionnaires to members of the Nazi Party. And they asked them, why had they become Nazis? And interestingly enough, it was not Hitler's anti-Semitism that appealed to them. Not that these people were philo-Semites. That's not the issue. What appealed to them was, again, his ferocious anti-communism. Again, it's so hard. What I was about to say, it's so hard for an American to understand this. But listen, again, forgive me, I don't mean to be condescending or pedantic. Look at our own country. We're 4,500 miles from the Soviet border. There was never a threat of the Red Army coming in here. And look at our own country. Red Scare after Red Scare after Red Scare. The Hollywood blacklist, the first Senator McCarthy. People were petrified of communism. Hitler said, in effect, you may not like me, just the middle-class educated Germans. You may not like me. You may not like my boys, the bully boys, the SA, the Schnomo-Abteilung, the guys in the brown shirts. You may not like us. You may not want your daughters to marry my boys here. But one thing you should know, we're the only ones that can save Germany from communism. That's important. And remember, many Germans thought that the Versailles Treaty, this is the 100th anniversary of World War I, the beginning of World War I. And the war ends on November 11th, 1918, but it really doesn't end until the Treaty of Versailles that is signed on June 28th of 1919, exactly 5 years, incidentally, after the assassination took place in Sarajevo. For the Germans, it was a diktat, a dictated peace. You got to reverse it. Germany lost territory. Germany was the famous Article 231, the War Guilt Clause in the Treaty of Versailles, that labeled Germany as guilty for the beginning of the war. Germans were furious, ferocious.
But there was a lie also, isn't it, like to the winners the spoils?
That's
just
correct.
to turn it, because really Germany was just as much fault as anybody else.
Germany was more at
really.
fault than anybody else.
Yeah,
Germany really was more at fault, although you're quite correct. Historians will debate this. I'll give a plug here. I'm giving a lecture series on World War I and the Jews at Agudath Achim starting on September 8th.
35 years you've been doing that.
Right.
And how long have you been at Union College?
47.
47,
Yeah.
wow.
So Germans wanted the repudiation of Versailles. Hitler said, I'll spit in the face of Versailles. And then, history is not mathematics. It really isn't. You cannot, or chemistry for that matter, you cannot say A plus B produces C. But sometimes you can come close. So please listen. In 1928, the Nazis received less than 5% of the vote. 800,000 votes, something like that.
In the United States?
No,
in Germany.
In Germany. That's a year before the Depression. 800,000 votes, less than 5%. 1930, a year after the Depression, they get 6.5 million votes. July 1932, they get 13,187,000 votes, 37.6% of the popular vote. So It's anti-communism, repudiation of Versailles, and a belief that only the Nazis can bring Germany out of the Depression.
And it wasn't.
These are the things that lead those people that you're talking about, judges and doctors and lawyers. And I must tell you, just told me that a relative was a physician. It is not the shining hour of medicine. That is the performance of German physicians in Germany in this period of time. Even before the Nazis came to power, virtually more than any other profession in Germany, it was German doctors that went over to the Nazis. They saw Hitler as the great healer. That
In which way?
With his eugenics, that is, we've got to compensate for the dead. All of those people that we lost in World War I, we lost the best and the brightest. So how are we going to compensate for that? Well, one of those, the argument that German women have to have more children, but more than that is, we got to make sure that quality compensates for quantity.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to get rid of these people who are inferior, mentally, physically inferior. And also, now this gets us into an awkward area. I'm sure.
It's my favorite area.
I'm not sure. Let me just say to you that the first anti-cigarette smoking campaign in the world was established by the Nazis in the 1930s. And the Nazis were probably among the first to establish the linkage between cigarette smoking, heart disease, and cancer.
Wow.
And so, for many German physicians, this was something, he's going to heal our country. He may be a lunatic in certain things, but he's going to heal our country. To show you how the German medical system went over to the Nazis, a book appeared not long before the Nazis came to power, The Sins of the Blood, in which it was argued by the writer that if a single drop of sperm, Jewish sperm, enters the vagina of an Aryan woman, that woman is forever incapable of giving birth to an Aryan child. That's crackpot obstetrics. That's loony. And yet, virtually every German medical society, before the Nazis came to power, adopted ideas similar to that.
And isn't it ironic that Hitler himself would not have been part of the Aryan race?
That's a matter of debate. We don't know that. His latest and best biographer, Ian Kershaw, has disputed this idea. The old idea was that Hitler's grandmother on the father's side, I think that's what it was, worked as a domestic, as a servant for a Jewish family, a middle-class Jewish family that had some teenage or even older teenage Jewish boys, and that they impregnated this woman. And that was actually, that was always rumored. Even those Nazis in the party that were opposed to Hitler used that. Kershaw says, and he's gone through the evidence, there is no evidence, he says there's no evidence to suggest that that was the case. But the interesting thing is, if you want to play Sigmund Freud here,
sure.
The interesting thing is, did Hitler know about this? That this charge was made? Probably did. Did he believe it? That we don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Did it affect his attitude towards Jews? Don't know that. All I come back to the first thing that I said to you. I can tell you what he did.
Right.
I can tell you how he did it, when he did it, and why he did certain things. But in terms of why he became the man that he did, they were up in the air.
I have to ask you this question before we run out of time. Did you know a gentleman in Colony called Richard Marowitz? Did you run across him?
Is that the man with the hat?
With
Yeah,
Hitler's-
Right.
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 He passed
I
away
knew of
recently.
him. I know he passed away, and I'm
Right.
sorry to hear that.
But your paths didn't cross?
No,
Okay.
our paths did not cross. He was a very impressive man. Actually, anybody who fought in World War II is really impressive.
But the fact that he
The fact that
found-
he found the hat and it's a
jumped
very
on it.
and jumped on it. It's a very, very interesting story, and I believe the story.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I just wanted to know if maybe you're...
No, I did not
Because-
encounter him.
okay.
I knew of him. I read about him, but I never had the privilege
I had a
of
chance to
meeting him.
interview him for an audio interview just a few months before he passed. But when you've been teaching all these years, 47 years, it's hard to believe you're so young. You must have started as a
yeah.
child. I wanted to, so many students, and sometimes you're self-deprecating in your talks about what your students tell you. What's been some of the most fascinating, or one of the most fascinating conclusions that a student has brought to you, that a light bulb went off, or you would say, oh, well, that's a new way of looking at,
In the Holocaust class that I teach it's the largest class. It's 200 students.
Really, that many?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what percentage maybe would you say is Jewish? Just
Less than half,
really?
which is a surprise.
Mm-hmm.
The students know something about the Holocaust. They don't know the enormity of the Holocaust, and they don't know. Again, when I teach the course, I deal in the macro terms, the Nazi theories, and things like that. But I also try to do it on a personal basis, to talk how they killed individual families and things like that. The students are appalled by the brutality. And they ask the same question: how can it be in the 20th century that people can do things like this? I read them things from memoirs and stuff, or I describe them. They're horrible. They're absolutely horrible. The Nazis had no moral bottom, none whatsoever. Had they had a nuclear weapon, they would have used it. And again, going to what we began your question in the beginning, Hamas, Hezbollah, ISIS, they have no moral bottom either. If they had nuclear weapons, you can bet your last buck they would use it. Had they had anything of mass destruction, they would use it. And that, I think, characterizes the Nazis. Only the difference was the Nazis had the means, and they used it.
It's interesting because I went to the Holocaust Museum with a number of kids that's in Washington, D.C., 8th graders, and we were in line waiting, and I could tell they're non-Jewish, they're from, and I schmooze with the good rabbi, I'm always schmoozing with people, and they're from Oklahoma, so they're non-Jews. I just said, there's so many things to see in Washington, D.C. Why did you come all the way? I mean, this is not the only thing, but, to pick out the Holocaust Museum. So they just say it was interesting. It was some vague answer, but it's interesting why a non-Jew would show up for the Holocaust to your class. And, for example, I just say it's funny that one of the things is the American Indians or the Native Americans. And they were not wiped out, but
Right.
the Americans did a number on them, bottom
Right.
line. And, I saw it because I was in Washington, D.C. This is right after the Holocaust. We said, no, it's a shame, it's a problem. I'm happy, God forbid. And I didn't say, look at that. It's not my people, it's Native American. Okay, it's a shame. And, it doesn't affect me as much as, I feel for the Holocaust.
Right.
So I was wondering if the non-Jews are saying, it's a shame, nobody should get killed, the Jewish people, but...
One of the things that the American Jewish community has done well is to make the American public aware of the Holocaust. People know something. You say the Holocaust, people know about it. They may not know the details, the dimensions and things, but they know about it. And the Holocaust is as much a chapter, you can make a case, it is as much a chapter in the history of the non-Jews as it is in the history of the Jews. And by that I mean, we come back to the question that we were wrestling with before. The Jews didn't kill Jews. The Holocaust was not a consequence of Jews killing Jews. The Holocaust was a consequence of non-Jews murdering, again, 6 million Jews. So how could it be in the 20th century that people would resort to this type of thing? And then, of course, an important point in the Holocaust was a pan-European war against the Jews. You can't say the Nazis did. Of course, the Nazis did it. They were the primary impetus. The tragedy confronting the Jewish people was that there wasn't a country in Europe, not a single country in Europe, where there was no support for the murder of Jews. Now, I'm not giving you Berk's law of the Holocaust, but I'll tell you, the further east you go, the greater is the degree of indigenous collaboration. But even in the West European countries, the democratic countries, Belgium, the Netherlands, France. Even in those countries, there was considerable support. Even in Scandinavia, even in Denmark. Now, Denmark stands out as the one country that actually saved its Jews. But there were Danes that fought for the SS. There were people there. So I think students want to learn about this. It is also much closer in time than the
Middle
extermination
Ages.
of the Indians. Much closer in
That's
time.
interesting.
And also, there's something else, and that is both the killers and the killed resemble very much our students. That is, most of our students at Union probably don't know any American Indians, but they know Jews.
Right.
It's interesting.
They know Jews.
It's a good way to
And-
wrap up because we're,
And the other thing is, of course, some of the people who did the killing were very much like themselves.
right.
Middle-class people, professionals, and so on.
You know, Professor, we're out of time, and that's very unfortunate because I could sit here the whole day and listening to you, and I know you have what to talk about for a whole day, a whole week. But again, I want to just thank you again for being on the Jewish View and continue your good work of educating people about the Holocaust and do it with good health.
Thank you for having
Thank
me.
you.